Story number 1: The Phantom Passenger. Sarah had been driving for Uber for just over a year, and she'd seen her fair share of strange passengers. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened on that chilly October night in Seattle. It was around 2 a.m. when Sarah received a pickup request from a residential area in the suburbs. As she pulled up to the address, she noticed the house was completely dark. No porch light, no sign of movement inside. She double-checked the app to make sure she had the right location. After waiting for a few minutes, Sarah was about to cancel the ride when she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. A tall, thin man in a dark coat approached the car, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she reminded herself that she'd picked up plenty of eccentric characters during late-night shifts. The man slid into the backseat without a word. Sarah greeted him cheerfully, trying to mask her unease. "Good evening. Where are we headed tonight?" No response. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but the passenger's face was still hidden in shadow. "Sir? I need to know your destination." After an uncomfortably long pause, a raspy voice replied, "Pioneer Square." Sarah nodded and started driving, grateful to have broken the silence. She attempted small talk, commenting on the unseasonably cold weather, but the man remained mute. As they approached downtown, Sarah noticed something odd. Despite the chill in the air, there was no fog on the windows where the passenger was sitting. In fact, when she looked in the rearview mirror again, she could swear she saw right through him to the back of the seat. Sarah's heart began to race. She blinked hard, convinced her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. When she looked again, the man appeared solid. Still unsettling, but definitely there. They were nearing Pioneer Square when the passenger finally spoke again. "Stop here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah pulled over, relieved the ride was almost over. "This is good?" she asked, turning to face the backseat. Her blood ran cold. The car was empty. Panic rising in her throat, Sarah jumped out of the car, looking wildly around the deserted street. There was no sign of the man. No sound of footsteps, no slamming doors. He had vanished into thin air. Shaking, Sarah got back in her car and locked the doors. She was about to call the police when she noticed something on the back seat, a small, antiquated book. With trembling hands, she picked it up. It was a diary, the cover worn and faded. Inside the front cover was an inscription, "Property of Edward Mathers, 1907. Sarah flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she read. The diary belonged to a man who had lived in Seattle at the turn of the century. In his final entry, dated October 3, 1907, Edward wrote about taking a late-night carriage ride to Pioneer Square. He never made it to his destination. The driver reported that his passenger had simply disappeared from the moving carriage. The next day, Edward's body was found floating in Elliott Bay. His death was ruled a suicide, but the mysterious circumstances were never fully explained. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the implications of what had just happened washing over her. She had given a ride to a ghost, the spirit of a man who had died over a century ago, reenacting his final journey. With shaking hands, Sarah reported the ride as completed in her app. To her shock, the fare had already been paid, in cash. There, on the passenger seat, sat a stack of bills that hadn't been there before. But these weren't ordinary bills, they were old, the type of currency used in the early 1900s. Sarah never drove for Uber again after that night. She tried to research Edward Mathers, but found little information beyond old newspaper clippings about his mysterious death. The diary she kept as proof of her encounter, though she rarely showed it to anyone. Years later, Sarah learned that she wasn't the only driver to have experienced something supernatural in Pioneer Square. Other rideshare drivers reported picking up passengers who vanished, or seeing ghostly figures on the streets late at night. The area, it turned out, was known for paranormal activity, with a history stretching back to Seattle's founding. Sometimes, on cold October nights, Sarah finds herself drawn back to Pioneer Square. She sits in her car, watching the shadows, half expecting to see a tall figure in a dark coat emerge from the mist. And sometimes, just sometimes, she swears she can hear the clip-clop of phantom carriage wheels on the cobblestone streets, carrying the lost soul of Edward Mathers on his endless final ride. Story number 2: The Unwanted Passenger. Jason had been driving for Uber for 3 years in Las Vegas, and he thought he'd seen it all. The city's vibrant nightlife meant a constant stream of colorful characters and wild stories. But nothing could have prepared him for the terrifying ride that would change his life forever. It was a quiet Tuesday night in July 2018. The oppressive desert heat lingered even after sunset, and Jason was grateful for his car's air conditioning. Around 11 p.m., he received a pickup request from a residential area in North Las Vegas. As he pulled up to the address, Jason noticed the house seemed abandoned. Overgrown weeds choked the front yard, and several windows were boarded up. He was about to cancel the ride when a woman emerged from the shadows. She was in her mid-30s, with long dark hair and a frantic expression. As she approached the car, Jason could see she was trembling. "Please, you have to help me," she said as she slid into the backseat. "We need to go. Now." Jason hesitated. Something felt off, but the woman looked genuinely frightened. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need me to call the police?" "No," she nearly shouted. "No police. Just drive. Please." Against his better judgment, Jason started driving. He tried to calm the woman down, asking where she wanted to go, but she just kept insisting he drive away from the house. After a few minutes, Jason glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The woman's eyes were wide with terror, fixed on something in the backseat beside her. But when Jason looked, there was nothing there. "He's here," the woman whispered. "Oh God, he found me." Jason's heart raced. He considered pulling over, but the genuine fear in the woman's voice made him press on. "Who's here?" "Ma'am, there's no one else in the car." The woman began to sob. "You don't understand. He won't leave me alone. I thought I'd escaped him, but he always finds me." As they drove through the empty streets, the temperature in the car plummeted. Jason could see his breath fogging up the windshield, despite the warm night outside. The woman's sobs turned to screams. "Stop the car!" she shrieked. "Let me out!" Jason slammed on the brakes, and the woman bolted from the vehicle. He watched in horror as she ran down the dark street, seeming to struggle against an invisible force. Shaken, Jason reported the incident to Uber and the police. He learned that the house he'd picked her up from had been the scene of a gruesome murder-suicide 5 years earlier. A man had killed his wife before taking his own life, and their spirits were said to haunt the property. In the days that followed, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home from that ride. Objects in his apartment would move on their own. He'd wake up to find all the faucets running. Sometimes, late at night, he'd hear a woman's muffled sobs coming from empty rooms. A week after the incident, Jason was awoken by a crash in his living room. He found a framed photo of himself on the floor, the glass shattered. Written in the dust on the coffee table were the words, "Help me." Terrified, Jason sought help from a local medium. She performed a cleansing ritual on both Jason and his apartment, explaining that the spirit of the murdered woman had latched onto him, seeking protection from her husband's ghost. The paranormal activity subsided after the cleansing, but Jason was forever changed by the experience. He quit driving for Uber and became an advocate for domestic violence survivors, volunteering at a local shelter. Years later, Jason still feels a chill when he passes the abandoned house where it all began. Sometimes, he swears he can see a woman's face in the boarded-up windows, silently pleading for help. The case of the murdered woman was never fully solved. Police reports from 2013 identified her as Maria Sanchez, a 34-year-old immigrant who had been trying to leave her abusive husband. Neighbors reported hearing arguments and screams the night of the murder-suicide, but by the time police arrived, it was too late. Some say Maria's spirit remains trapped, endlessly reliving her final, desperate attempt to escape. Others believe she's still searching for someone to help her find peace. As for Jason, he keeps the shattered photo frame as a reminder of that terrifying night. He's since married and moved to a new home, but he never drives after dark if he can help it. And on quiet nights, when the wind whistles just right, he sometimes thinks he hears a faint voice calling out, "Please. You have to help me." Story number 3: The Haunted Hotel on Route 66, a chilling encounter. The neon sign of the Sunstone Motel flickered a sickly yellow in the twilight, casting an eerie glow on the deserted Route 66. Worn and faded, the motel seemed like a relic from a bygone era, a forgotten stop on the once thriving Mother Road. Intrigued by its vintage charm, Sarah and her boyfriend, Alex, decided to spend the night. The vacancy sign hung crookedly, and the lobby was shrouded in a thick layer of dust. A weathered-looking woman with tired eyes appeared from behind the counter. "Just one room left," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Their room, number 13, was at the end of a dimly lit hallway. The furniture was old and threadbare, the wallpaper peeling at the edges. An unsettling chill permeated the room, despite the afternoon sun filtering through the dusty windows. An ornate gramophone sat in the corner, a lone record placed on the spindle. Ignoring the unsettling atmosphere, Sarah unpacked, while Alex fiddled with the dusty radio. Suddenly, a crackle filled the air, followed by the mournful strains of a jazz melody. Sarah jumped, startled. The record on the gramophone began to spin, the music filling the room with a melancholic beauty. As the sun dipped below the horizon, an unsettling quiet settled over the motel. Alex stepped out to explore, returning with a story. He'd met an old trucker at the diner down the road, a man who spoke of the Sunstones' troubled past. A young couple had honeymooned there years ago, only to vanish without a trace. Their room, number 13, remained untouched ever since. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She glanced at the gramophone. The music had stopped. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, the curtains billowing outwards. A faint, almost translucent figure materialized across the room, a young woman in a vintage dress, her face etched with sadness. Sarah gasped, fear constricting her throat. Alex rushed back in, his eyes widening at the sight. The woman's spectral form floated towards them, a faint whimper escaping her lips. They could hear a muffled sob coming from the bathroom. Alex, emboldened by fear, grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her towards the sound. The bathroom door creaked open, revealing a dusty bathtub filled with swirling, ectoplasmic mist. Sarah's stomach lurched. Was this where the couple had vanished? The woman's form solidified briefly, a look of desperation etched on her face, before dissipating into the mist. Panic seized them. They stumbled back from the bathroom, the room growing colder by the moment. The gramophone started playing again, the mournful tune echoing through the room. The phone on the nightstand rang, causing them to jump again. Sarah cautiously picked up the receiver. On the other end, a voice filled with static rasped, "Don't let them take you. Leave." The line went dead. The music stopped abruptly and the room plunged into darkness. Sarah and Alex fumbled for the flashlight on Sarah's phone, illuminating the room with a weak beam. The ghost of the young woman stood before them, a faint smile on her lips. They understood. She needed their help. Taking a deep breath, Sarah spoke to the apparition, promising they wouldn't rest until they found out what happened. A surge of warmth filled the room as the ghost nodded in gratitude and faded away. Driven by a newfound purpose, they searched the room. Alex spotted a hidden compartment behind a loose floorboard. Inside, they found dusty files and a faded photograph, the missing couple, their faces filled with happiness. The files revealed a story of a jealous ex-boyfriend, a local mechanic, who'd tampered with their car's brakes. They had crashed into a nearby ravine, their bodies never recovered. The ghost, unable to rest, was trapped in the room, reliving her final moments. Sarah and Alex knew they had to act. They contacted the local authorities, who arrived the next morning, intrigued by the couple's story. Following their leads, the police discovered the car wreckage and, eventually, the mechanic confessed. The Sunstone Motel was permanently closed, a marker placed at the accident site. Sarah and Alex left Route 66 forever changed. They had faced a chilling encounter and, against all odds, brought peace to a restless soul. The haunting of the Sunstone Motel became a chilling legend, a reminder of the secrets that sometimes lurk beneath the faded charm of forgotten places.